Hello and welcome back. This is Gina from McGuire. So lately I have seen many artists doing a really cool technique called acrylic pour. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to search on YouTube. It's a really amazing process. I've wanted to try it but don't have the supplies yet, so I thought I would figure out a way to get kind of a similar look using my card making supplies. Now for this technique, all you need pretty much is white embossing powder and some ink, and it's amazing the results that you can get. I'm going to start out by showing you a few different variations of this technique, and then we'll turn them into some simple cards. Now I'm starting out by creating a very thick piece to do this technique on. I die cut a bunch of circles and hearts using some Hero Arts die sets, and I've stacked 4 on top of each other. So I end up with a very thick die cut. I just make sure that I glue them together very well so that they won't curl up when we add the embossing powder. So my die cuts are stacked 4 thick, and I did a bunch of circles and hearts. Now I'm going to take one of these thick pieces we created and put a little handle on it with a piece of tape. Next, I'm going to press my VersaMark ink onto it. This will just make the surface sticky, and I will dip it into my white embossing powder. Now you could pour it on with a spoon. I'm just dipping it in since I have a large container to do so. Next, I will heat this up and we'll have this thick die cut covered with 1 layer of embossing powder. Now while it's still hot, I'm going to dip it back into the powder and add another layer. And I'll repeat this until I have about 5 layers of white embossing powder on this piece. Now, if you feel you can't move fast enough to dip it back in while it's still hot, you can let it cool in between each layer, add a new layer of VersaMark ink, and then add the more embossing powder. So it's just whatever works best for you. I just like to add the powder while it's still hot. That speeds the process up, and look at the cool look you get. It's a very smooth finish to your stacked die cut piece. Now you'll see you have enough embossing powder on there when it kind of moves by the force of your heat gun. Next, you'll want to give it several minutes to dry completely till it's cool to the touch. Next, I'm taking some Hero Arts shadow inks. These are dye ink cubes, and I'm pressing it right onto that white heat embossing. Now I'm sure you could probably use other types of inks, but I found that dye ink really works well for this. You could even try some water-based markers. But I went with these dye ink cubes because they're very easy to apply, and I have them in several colors. I'm kind of doing a rainbow here. You'll see that the ink kind of bubbles up a little bit on the surface. That's okay, it doesn't matter. We'll go ahead and heat this up and we'll get the really cool effect. So I'm going to try to hold this up to the camera so you can see. And I've sped it up a bit, but as I apply heat, you'll see that the colors soften and white bubbles come to the surface, which just gives a really fun look. Now it really isn't bubbles, but it's just the white embossing powder coming up to the top as you heat through all of those layers. Now again, this is much softer than what you started with, so if you want to, you can let that cool completely again and apply another layer of color and then heat it up again. I really like using the Hero Arts heat gun for this because it gets very hot. And the air coming out of it, you can use to push the embossing powder around. So you can see how the embossing powder is moving. That's thanks to the heat gun. And because I have so many layers, the embossing powder is free to move. So there you can see the white kind of coming to the surface and the beautiful result that you get. Okay, so I'm going to do a few more examples. That last one, I kind of did a rainbow stripes. Here I'm just kind of mushing down a few different colors of teal and green and blue inks. And as I put the heat to this, you can see that it softens and the white comes up to the surface. And you can use that heat gun to kind of move that color around. So my heat gun isn't actually touching the embossing powder, but it's very close. I'm very close to the surface of it, and look how gorgeous that is. Now I know the acrylic pour technique gives really vivid colors. If you want a vivid colors like that, what you can do is use colored embossing powders. However, I wanted to show you how to achieve this look with white embossing powder because more of us have white powders than a bunch of different colored ones. Here you can see this is a really good example of the ink kind of being pushed aside and the white coming up to the surface. So you can apply as many layers as you want. Just keep in mind that the more ink you put on, the more you're coloring that white powder. So eventually the white will start to look like a pastel color of whatever you're adding. So I usually only do 2 layers of inking, but you can definitely add more if you want to, and I'll show you an example of that later. Now, in addition to kind of moving the color around with your heat gun, you can also use like a toothpick or any other sharp tool. So here I'm going to drag a toothpick through the embossing powder just to create some areas of white or a little bit of movement in the background. Now I'm doing this to very hot embossing powder. You could let it cool a tiny bit and then do this and get more white showing. But I just wanted a little bit of mixing in the background. It almost looks like a fun tie-dye look. Okay, now I'm going to keep going through a few different examples here. I know somebody will probably ask if this damages your ink cubes. I looked at my ink cubes and they looked completely fine. I just would make sure that you don't push it into any embossing powder that is still hot or is still in powder. You want to make sure that it's completely heat set and cool before you add the ink. Okay, so here's another one where I kind of layered and smooshed some ink cubes down. I just press the ink pad directly onto the embossing powder. If you're concerned about doing that or want a softer, more controlled look, you can use an inking tool to apply the ink, such as a sponge dauber. So that's another option too. So I had a good old time making a bunch of these pieces. It's just so much fun. And because we stacked so many die cuts together, 4 of them, you don't have to worry about warping with adding all this heat embossing. Now before I show you how I pulled these into cards, I had one more example to share. I used the new Hero Arts My Monthly Hero Kit for March. There's this large 6x8 stamp set with sentiments that you can build together, a bunch of other goodies, and then check out these fantastic large word dies. I just love these word dies, and that's what I'm going to use on my cards today. I really like that Hero Arts makes this kit affordable each month. They charge about half the value of the kit, which is fantastic. I thought I would try today's technique on one of these word dies. So I took the Hello word die cut it 3 times, and glued the 3 together. So I have a stacked Hello word die cut here. Love the detail of this die. Now I'm pressing VersaMark ink onto the top of that stacked word die cut, dipping it into white embossing powder and heat setting it. Now once that's cool, I'm going to press more VersaMark ink on it and add another layer of white embossing. And I'll repeat that until I have 4 layers of embossing powder on this. Now the technique won't show up as much on this thin lined word die cut as it did on those larger pieces that I showed you earlier, but I think the results are still fun. I did the exact same thing I did before. I pressed ink right onto the white embossing. Once I have it covered with ink, I'll go ahead and add heat to that. Now you'll notice that I'm working on a cutting board. The reason I have this cutting board is I like that it has a handle so I can pick it up and move it around as I'm heating things. And I use this board also for watercolor so I can tape paper to it and kind of tilt it when I need to. Now the colors were soft, so I decided to go ahead and add another layer of ink to it and heat it up again. And then once I'm done, I'll have that look of white kind of peeking through the color. It just gives a really fun, unique finish. Okay, so now we have all these pieces ready to go. I'm going to keep the rest of the cards very simple. I used the new Hero Arts Bold Graphic Confetti die. This cuts a piece that covers the front of a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card perfectly. Really like the detail of this. You could fill in each of the little pieces with different colors, but I'm just going to go for a white on white look. I did decide to trim a little bit off each of the sides of this piece so that when I add it to my card, there's a white trim around the edge. To adhere it, I found it easiest to do little dots of liquid adhesive around the outside and a few in the center, and then press that down onto a top folding 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch note card. Next, I can put some very strong adhesive on the back of my die cut here and add it right to the center of our card. You'll want to use something strong for this. You could use a strong double-sided tape or a strong liquid adhesive. This hug sentiment is 3 hugs die cuts glued together, so it's stacked for dimension, and I added it right to the center. I decided not to embellish this in any way to keep it simple, and instead stamp a small sentiment on the inside of each of the cards. I decided to go with an I miss you sentiment for most of the cards, so I'm using my MISTI to place this so that I can easily put each card in and stamp the sentiment over and over. Another option for this hugs card is to leave the sentiment out of the inside, and when you come up with an occasion that you need something particular, like get well soon or thinking of you or with sympathy, you can add that sentiment to the inside. Now these sentiments that I used, such as I miss you, are from one of the other new Hero Arts stamp sets that's recently been released. It's this one that you see on the left called Text Me. It's got these fun little images to create a text card, but I just used the sentiments from it. Okay, so I wanted to show you a closer look at all of the completed cards. This heart was one that I did at the beginning, where I pressed ink onto the white embossing, and then I moved it around with the heat from my heat gun, and I only did 1 layer of color. You can see that beautiful look that you get with the white embossing coming to the surface. I have a lot of examples with blues and greens because I like those colors. However, you could definitely do this technique with whatever color inks you might like. Also, I created most of my examples on circles and hearts because it was a nice base for this technique. But you could even just cut squares of white cardstock and stack those together for this technique if that's all you have. Now on this card and my next few examples, I had dragged a toothpick through the wet embossing powder just for the look of movement. So you can see the results that you get from that. And I think this one right here is my favorite of all of them. I just love all that's going on that embossed piece. I use the hugs die cut on most of my cards because that's a type of card that I send quite often. But also included in that Hero Arts kit are the words hello, thank you, and the hugs. So you'll see I did a few with the thank you and the hello. And really I think the thank you fits nicely on top of the die cut heart or the die cut circle as you see here. Now this one's a little bit different. I used that background die to make an impression into the note card using an embossing mat. But I decided I liked adding the die cut right onto a white note card instead. So I only did 1 with this version. But you can use background dies to make an impression on cardstock using an embossing mat, and it's definitely a great option to have. I also created a few with the rainbow look. I think that's a great way to create a colorful element pretty quickly for a card. Okay, so there is one that I did a little bit different than the rest. This one I just used red ink, and I did about 5 or 6 layers of red ink onto the embossing. So you can see that the white embossing powder kind of started turning a light pink, which is a beautiful look, just another option that you can get. And then finally, here is that hello die cut covered with this technique. A lot of little detail to that I wish you could see in real life. So there you have a fun way to kind of take your embossing powders and ink and get a new look. If you are interested in any of these products, I do link them below in my YouTube description. You can also go to my blog for more information and more photos of these cards. In the middle are a couple other videos you might like, and if you haven't done so, please hit the subscribe button so you can see more videos in the future. Thanks for spending time with me. Have a great week, and we'll see you soon.